Hello, everyone. I hope you've been resting and sleeping well lately. I am back again with a new book. It is titled The Treacherous Heart by Cynthia Harrod-Eagles. Let me just give you a quick synopsis of the story. It's about Anne Simmons. Um, Actually, let me just read what the book says. Anne Simmons is content living with her widowed father in a sleepy Dorset town. She has a good job in a solicitor's office and a kind, reliable, and good-looking boyfriend, Joe. But when enigmatic, sophisticated Michael Conrad appears on the scene, she suddenly feels that something is missing from her life. Should she risk a safe future with loyal, adoring Joe for the dangerous allure and excitement of this fascinating stranger? Should she? Well, we are all going to find out. So this is the new book, The Treacherous Heart, author Cynthia Harrod-Eagles. As always, I hope my readings are helpful, that you're also finding them enjoyable. I'm open to any sort of feedback, any criticism you might have. I'm all about growth, so please leave a comment and also if you have any particular books that you want me to read, any kind of story as well. Perhaps you are interested in something more action-based, just anything, any suggestions. I am all ears and eyes as I'll be reading. Definitely open for suggestions. Okay? All right. Now, I shall begin. 8 o'clock, Anne, love. Time to get up. I brought you a cup of tea. Anne struggled upwards through the mists of sleep at the sound of her father's voice, and with an effort raised herself onto her elbow to take the cup and saucer from her father's hand. Thanks, Dad. You shouldn't bother, you know, she said sleepily. She didn't really like tea in bed first thing in the morning, especially not such a huge cup of strong, dark brown tea. But Dad did it to be kind, and she couldn't hurt his feelings. Oh, it's no trouble, love. Have to keep the workers happy, you know. He smiled as he said it, but Anne knew that underneath his cheerfulness, he didn't really like her to go out to work. His ideas were so old-fashioned that he thought young ladies should stay at home and wait to get married. Anne smiled as her father took himself off to let her get up in privacy. Those days were long gone, if they ever existed. Nowadays, a girl expected to have to work, and happiness came from accepting that and making the work as interesting as possible. If you took an interest in everything you did, Anne found, the days passed quickly and happily. However, there wasn't time today to philosophize. It was Thursday, and Thursday was market day in the town of Market Winton, where she and her father lived. Anne listened for a moment to make sure where her father was, and then opened the window of her room and poured the tea carefully into the flower bed outside. Dad had only taken to bringing her tea in the mornings since Mother died, almost a year ago. Anne thought he did it, partly because he was lonely for Mom and wanted to fuss over someone, and partly because he thought Anne was lonely. She did miss her mother, of course, but Mom had been ill for a long time, and her death had been what the doctors call a merciful release. Anne looked out the window to see what sort of a day it was going to be. It wasn't much of a view from any of the windows. The backside of Winton Parva Station, a quiet piece of waste, ground deep with nettles, rose bay willow herb, yarrow and rusting cars, and the tiny strip of garden Dad had planted between the low wooden fence and the house. He managed to get an amazing amount out of that tiny strip, she thought. He had a passion for the old-fashioned flowers, wallflowers, pansies, stocks, and the like, and in among the beds of bright, rich color, he also grew some vegetables, surprisingly successfully. Mind you, he did have plenty of time to potter between trains. Dad was a station master of Winton Parva, and the fact that he was the sole member of staff showed how little traffic there was on the line now. The job was, in fact, a kind of semi-retirement for him, and he had been given it after losing a foot in an accident on the lines some years ago. Dad was very philosophical about his disability and always attempted to make light of it. He even joked about the accident itself, referring to it as the day the Waterloo train caught him on the hop. Your mother was never happy with the move down here, Dad had told Anne once. She looked on it as coming down in the world. But you know, though I never let on to her, I think I'll like it better here. It's peaceful, and I've got my bit of garden and my bike to take little trips out. I don't think I'd want to move it away now. The sound of the 8:09 down train jerked Anne from her reverie, and she hastened to wash and dress and get out to the kitchen. Dad always started breakfast before the 8:09. Anne finished the preparations, and they ate together before the 8:35 up train called him away again and gave Anne her signal to set off for work. Dad arrived promptly and shrugged off his uniform jacket and hung it on the back of the door before sitting down at the narrow table. Breakfast ready, is it, love? Just coming. Many on the train? Quite a lot. Some holiday makers with tents and a bunch of soldiers, and a crate of pigeons for Tom Jenkins. Could never see any sense in pigeons myself, unless they eat 'em. Can't pet 'em or play with 'em. Take 'em 100 miles in a box on a train, let 'em out and go home again. Where's the fun in that? Not much fun for the pigeons either, I shouldn't think, Anne said, bringing the 2 plates to the table. They ate in silence for a while, and Anne watched her father covertly, knowing what was coming next. Rabbits, now. I'll give you rabbits. Nice, pretty, friendly creatures. No smell to speak of, and a lot of nice eating on a rabbit. Rabbits I can understand, but pigeons? You haven't the room for rabbits, Anne said, as she always did when her father brought up the subject. He had always wanted to keep rabbits, but her mother had had such an aversion to them that he had never done more than talk wistfully about the idea. Now that mother was gone, he reverted to the subject more and more often, but what Anne said was true. There was no room. There's all that waste land. That's a terrible waste of good land, cars and junk and weeds. I could clear a little bit of that, and You couldn't. It'd be trespassing, Anne said firmly. It's railway land, her father said simply. Yes, but it isn't attached to the house. It'd be trespassing. You know how tough the railway board was when Romilly Jones dug up that patch and grew cabbages on it. Her father sighed and reached for his cup. I suppose you're right, but I'd like a few rabbits. Keep me out of mischief between trains. His eyes gleamed. But I suppose you'd know all about trespass and so on. I ought to take your word. The Romilly Jones business was one of the few court cases which had been handled by the firm of solicitors for whom Anne worked. They dealt mainly with land and conveyancing and other documentation, but they had taken on the case partly because of Anne's interest and partly because there had been some thought of contesting ownership of the land in question. But Romilly Jones, a local layabout reputed to be part gypsy, had bitten off more than he could choose and taken on British Rail and had been soundly beaten. Anne found it a useful check on her father, who tended to look upon everything to do with the railways as belonging to him. Well, said their father at last, pushing his chair back, I'd better get across for the train. Leave the washing up, love, and I'll do it later. Okay, Dad, Anne said. I'll see you later then. Yes, of course, market day today. Well, bring Joe back for tea, if he's time, Dad said, pausing at the door to add wickedly, there's a man who'd understand rabbits. And he was gone, leaving Anne laughing. 10 minutes later, she was on her way herself, cycling the 1.5 miles into the center of Market Winton to the office in Church Street of Messrs. Wilson and Paul, solicitors and commissioners for oaths. The 10 minutes were spent putting on her careful makeup and attending to her hair, in the wake of seeing the film of The Great Gatsby. Anne had had her hair restyled in the fashion of the 30s, shorter at the back, a jaw length at the front, and very smooth and straight, which made the most of its dark brown thickness and its copper lights. It suited her rather gaunt features, her high cheekbones, large eyes, and small full mouth, and she complemented the hairstyle with the makeup of the same period. It took care to achieve the right effect, and since it couldn't be hurried, she always set aside enough time in the morning for the task. Anne was not by nature a methodical girl, but when she had applied for the job as secretary to the firm, she had been taken on a 6 weeks' trial basis, because the head of the firm, Mr. Crass, I thought her too young and probably too flighty for the position. For 6 weeks she had kept up a mind-boggling effort to appear mature, steady, efficient, methodical, and reliable, all the things she was not. The effort had been worth it, for she had been confirmed in the position, and now, 4 years later, she was still there, and much valued by both partners. The sustained pretense had by now become such second nature to her that she almost was all those things they thought her to be. And since she strove to make her job interesting by getting absorbed in the business the firm transacted, she was also becoming quite knowledgeable in legal matters, which added to her air of staid respectability. Her natural sense of fun had to be kept for her time off, for evenings and weekends, and it was that side of her which made her so look forward to Thursday's market day. At 10 to 9, the town was already busy, with cars pulling trailers, making their slow way through the narrow streets to the market ground, and cattle lorries scraping another layer of stone off the corner of the public house, which jutted out at the junction of Cow Lane and Market Street. The town of Market Winton had never been designed for motor traffic, and later in the day it would be full of cursing motorists losing themselves in the temporary one-way systems. Anne herself had had experience of these one-way systems, and her private opinion was that they had been designed by the police as a punishment for those drivers who were perverse enough to bring their cars into the town center on a Thursday. Once in the system, it was impossible to get out again, for whatever turnings you took, you always ended up in the town square, half a mile from the market. Eventually, you yielded to the inevitable, parked the car alongside the horse trough, and walked the rest of the way. Church Street was within sight of the marketplace, and Anne felt the first tremors of excitement at the noise and bustle that was already building up. She wheeled her bicycle across the road and parked it in the bike rack behind the new Commercial Union building, which was next door to the old gray stone house, on the upper floor of which was her office. She drew the enormous heavy key out of her handbag, unlocked the door, and with a last glance at the marketplace, went in. That she had the key to the office was a sign of the firm's confidence in her. Mr. Whitelaw, the younger partner, who lived 4 miles away at Winton Magna, had the other key. Mr. Cass, the senior partner, drove in each day from his large house at Blandford, and relied on one or the other of them to be there first. Mr. Cass never came in before 10:30, feeling that, at his time of life, that was a civilized hour to think of starting work. But Mr. Whitelaw was keen, and also liked to surprise Anne, keep her on her toes, as he put it, and was occasionally in before her. He arrived this morning on the dot of 9, and appeared rather disappointed not to have pipped Anne to the post. "Ah, good morning, Miss Simmons. On time morning, I see." Anne, with a straight face, pretended to misunderstand him. "Good morning, Mr. Whitelaw. Yes, you are on time. I was a little early today." He said. "Well, bring the post in straight away, will you?" And he disappeared into his office, rather crestfallen. Anne smiled to herself. Round one to me, she thought. Mr. Whitelaw was the son of the man who had bought out the business from the original partners, Wilson and Paul, and for that same reason Mr. Cass still sometimes referred to him as young Mr. Whitelaw. Mr. Cass was about 68, so perhaps Mr. Whitelaw appeared young to him. But since the younger partner was nearing 50, the title always amused Anne. Anne opened and sorted the mail, taking note of one or two matters in which she was taking a particular interest, and then she took the pile of letters to Mr. Whitelaw and stood beside the desk while he went through them and took a private look at Anne's appearance. It was for this morning inspection, as she called it, that Anne took the trouble with her appearance. Mr. Whitelaw was not above commenting on anything he found wrong. He had a secret dislike of women in offices, and was glad to find fault if he could. At first, it had terrified Anne, for it was her first job, and she didn't know whether she might be dismissed out of hand if anything were amiss. Now, 4 years later, she found the situation amusing, and with all the confidence she had built up over those years, she looked upon the inspection as a kind of a game. As she grew more difficult to fall to Mr. Whitelaw's standards, became more exacting, and the more he tried to catch her out, the more delighted she was to ape the perfect secretary and disappoint him. It was another of the ways in which she enlivened her life, which otherwise might fall into the trap of routine and become dull. For routine was one of the things Anne dreaded, even though, inevitably, most of her life was ruled by it. In her secret heart, she believed life ought to be exciting and surprising, and she believed that she was the sort of girl who could cope with excitement and danger. One of her favorite pastimes was reading. She went through 2 books a week, from the library as well as our magazines, and whenever she read, she plunged right into the world in the book, becoming the heroine or even hero in her own mind until dear, sleepy old Winton and the solicitor's office were far away and forgotten. Of course, it was very unlikely that anything remotely exciting would ever happen to her, living and working as she did in a small country town, where the one high spot was the weekly market. But she had inherited from her father a strong streak of the ability to make do. He had always wanted a garden, but had to make do with a strip 10 feet by 3. Into that strip, however, he crammed more than most gardeners got into their whole garden, and she was sure he had more pleasure out of that strip than the owner of 150 feet could possibly have. In the same way, Anne built up the weekly market in her own mind and extracted every last ounce from it. The market was not the only source of entertainment, of course. Like all towns, Winton had its cinemas, pubs, and discos, along with the various more rural entertainments. Anne enjoyed them all. She liked the jumble sales and whist drives and school concerts and gymkhanas and flower shows. She went to the open day at the army camp and the NAAFI dances, and even helped with the old folks' tea party held in the town hall each December. If adventure was going to seek Anne out, it would have no difficulty in finding her, that was sure. At 10:30, while Anne was doing some filing, Mr. Cass arrived. "Good morning, Miss Simmons. What a lovely day." I always think it's especially nice when our good weather falls on a Thursday, he greeted her. Yes, isn't it lovely? She replied, smiling. She liked Mr. Cass, having a private idea that he was really rather wicked, and had a sense of humor which he indulged at young Mr. Wetlower's expense. Mr. Cass hung up his hat and coat carefully and brushed them with the flat of his hand. He had bought them when he was first made a senior partner of the firm, and didn't intend ever to replace them. Then he started on the long trek to his office, on the other side of the room. He moved so slowly Anne sometimes wondered if he'd make it before lunch. As he reached the door of his room, he turned and said to Anne, as he did every morning, "Ah, Miss Simmons, I wonder if you could possibly rustle up a cup of coffee for me." It was part of Anne's duties to make coffee in the morning and tea in the afternoon for both partners, but Mr. Cass always made it sound like a favor, which was one of the reasons she liked him. "Certainly, Mr. Cass. I'll put the kettle on now." "Thank you, Miss Simmons." "And then you can go for your own coffee." "Of course." "I hear tell," and his eyes twinkled gravely, "they have doughnuts at the Cozy Cafe this morning. Would you like me to bring you one back?" Anne asked innocently. Mr. Cass pretended to look offended. "I mentioned it only out of academic interest, Miss Simmons." On Thursdays, after she had made the partners their coffee, Anne always went out to the Cozy Cafe at the corner of Church Street for her own coffee break. It was one of the little treats that made Thursdays special. She never really knew whether Mr. Cass was hinting or not when he said things like that. Sometimes she brought him back a cake to have with his tea, and sometimes he accepted it, and sometimes he didn't. It all added to the variety. At 5 to 11, Anne switched off her typewriter, picked up her handbag, and crossed the street to the cafe. It was one of those arty little places with fumed oak tables and Windsor chairs, with chintz seat cushions, but the oak beams that ran across the low ceiling were genuine enough, and the coffee was good. Anne usually met her friend from school days, Wendy Stokes, for coffee here on Thursdays, and Wendy was already there, sitting at a table and watching the door. "Ah, there you are." "I didn't get my coffee. I thought I'd wait for you," Wendy said, as she came in. "You're early, aren't you?" Dear old punctual Anne. "I don't know. I believe you sit up there at your window with a stopwatch waiting to see me come down the street." "Don't be silly. It's just that you gave the impression of having been sitting here for some time. Shall we go in order?" The two girls went down to the counter together. Wendy also worked for solicitors, but hers was quite a different kind of firm from Wilson and Paul. It was a new firm of 4 young men, and occupied offices in the brand new building beside the car park at the back of Woolworth's. It did a lot of business, and had a name for being bright, go ahead, and up to all the modern trends. Mr. Wetlower spoke of the partners disparagingly as thrusters, and hinted that none of them knew the first thing about the law. Mr. Crass said more mildly that there was room in the world for all sorts of firms, but that nothing would ever replace the old family lawyer, the man of business. Wendy liked her job, and spoke rather patronizingly of Anne's, even though she was only one of 3 typists in the office, and hadn't the sole responsibility that Anne had. She was a plump, pretty girl, with vivid blue eyes, and was as perpetually untidy and disorganized as Anne was neat and punctual. 2 coffees, please, Wendy said to the girl behind the counter, and then turned her eyes to the display of cakes in the glass-fronted counter. Look at those crummy donuts. I thought you were on a diet, Anne commented mildly. I am. I was only saying look at them, Wendy said indignantly. They did look good. The cozy cafe was noted for its cake, all home-baked. Both girls usually had something with their coffee as part of the Thursday morning treat, but Wendy sometimes had pangs of conscience about it. She was almost always on a diet, but since she almost always cheated, it cancelled itself out, and she stayed the same shape, which was the shape nature intended her to be, and which, in Anne's opinion, suited her very well. I think I'll have a rum baba, Anne said, looking up at the assistant, who nodded. You'll have what? Well, what a greedy pig, Wendy said. In that case, I'll have something too. I was going to go without, but since you're setting me such a bad example, let me see. She mused over the glass case while Anne watched her with amusement. You know perfectly well, she said at last, that you always have the same as me, so why pretend to choose? That's half the fun, choosing, Wendy said with a grin. All right, I'll be different today. I'll have a rum baba. The assistant, looking thoroughly bewildered, served her, and they took their coffee and made their way back to their favorite seat by the window. Well now, Wendy said, when they were settled. What's the news? What have you been doing since the last time? What exciting adventures have come your way? Tell Auntie Wendy all. Don't spare the details. That won't take long, Anne said, smiling. I went to the disco on Saturday night, which you know because you were there. I went blackberrying with Dad on Sunday, and to the pictures on Sunday night. And the rest of the week has been work. Now you tell, what have you been doing? Are you still going out with Graham? I'm not sure, Wendy said. How can you be not sure? You seemed friendly enough with him on Saturday night. Graham Raphael was one of the young accountants who shared the office building with Wendy's firm of solicitors, and the big excitement of last week had been his asking Wendy out. Wendy had hailed it as the big romance, but since she started one of those about once a month, Anne had not taken it too seriously. Yes, I know, but we had a quarrel on the way home, and then we had a sort of disagreement on Sunday, so I don't think we're speaking to each other at the moment, Wendy said. I see, Anne said. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with your romances, and they seem to be on and off more quickly than ever. Are you ever afraid you'll run out of new men? Of course not, Wendy said airily. There are plenty of fish in the sea, even in a one-horse town like Winton, and I get bored with the poor fellows so easily. Why don't you try your hand, Anne? You might find you enjoy it. I'm sure you can't have much fun going about with poor old Joe. After all, you've been going out with him for, well, ever since we left school, and that must be 4 years now. I know, Anne said, not without a sigh. It is a long time, but I like Joe, and he's very fond of me, you know. I know, Wendy said impatiently, and you don't like to hurt his feelings. But you know perfectly well he doesn't appreciate you. All he really loves is pigs, and you're the wrong shape to compete with them. Anne laughed. You're absurd, she said, and to turn the conversation away from herself, she asked, So, if it isn't Graham, who is it? Well, I'm temporarily out of boyfriends at this moment in time, she said solemnly. So if anyone comes along who's extremely handsome, fairly rich, young, amusing, a man of the world, has good taste. Her voice trailed off, and both girls stared in the same direction. Through the big plate glass window of the cafe, they had a fine view of the street, and as Wendy was speaking, the very person she had been describing was walking towards them on the opposite side of the street. He was tall, handsome, elegant, dressed in the kind of clothes that you couldn't get on the Never Never at a chain tailor's in Winton High Street. He had an air of sophistication that spoke of larger fish ponds than Market Winton, and as he came closer, and found herself gazing at his face, and realizing that as well as being handsome, it was attractive, not always the same thing. He seemed to be strolling without a great purpose, and when he saw the cafe, he crossed the street and came in, and went through to the counter at the back without a glance at the two girls. They had both hastily withdrawn their eyes as he came in, not wanting to be caught staring at him, but when he had gone past, Wendy took another quick look and then said to Anne in an undertone, Whee! Who is that, I wonder? I don't know. I've never seen him before. It must be meant for me, just when I'm short of an escort, and on market day too. He's like something in a martini advert. Now, she leaned across the table with a mock serious air. Before I crash in and help myself, are you sure you wouldn't like to have a first go? Just for a change? Anne laughed. You are terrible. It's a good job. I know you're only joking. Anyway, he wouldn't look at me or you. Too sophisticated by half. She refused to turn her head and look at him again. They were both too old for that kind of thing. Anyway, don't get yourself too excited. He's probably only passing through. Wendy sighed. Don't I know it? Things like that don't happen in real life. Never mind. Graham's really quite as good looking as that, and probably lots nicer. So Graham's on again, is he? He will be by this afternoon, Wendy said cheerfully. We'd better be getting back, you know. It's 1/4 past already. Listen, I'll see you at the market this afternoon, so if you can coax Joe away from his pigs to take you into the fair, I want to show off how good Graham is on the rifle range. I'll try, but I doubt if he'll come, Anne said. Tell him there's bowling for a pig, Wendy directed wisely. That'll fetch him. Don't mock, Anne said, but she laughed all the same. Wendy was not far wrong. Anne had known Joe Halderthay for a very long time. He had gone to the same secondary school as she had, but being a few years older than her, he had not noticed her. Anne, however, had noticed Joe, and from early days he had been a sort of hero to her. He was a school sports champion, football, cricket, athletics, swimming, an all-round sportsman, and, as such people will be, very popular with both boys and girls in the school. He was not particularly good at his lessons, but he was good-natured and honest, and these things shone through even to little girls in the lower school. Besides, he was considered very good-looking, not especially tall, but broad-shouldered and athletic, fair-skinned, auburn-haired, blue-eyed, a real Dorsetman. By the time he left school and was beginning to take an interest in girls, Anne was not the only one who hung about the gates after school to get a glimpse of him passing on his bike, or lined the playing field during matches to cheer him. Joe left school and went to work on a farm over towards Felsham, about 5 miles from Winton Parver, where Anne lived. Farmhands work long hours, and Joe scarcely ever visited the haunts of young people. It was known that he was going out with one of the daughters of the farm manager, and in the fullness of time, never seeing him, Anne forgot him, and, had she been asked, would have assumed he had married the girl, so that should have been that. Anne, too, left school and did a secretarial course at the Technical College in Weymouth, a great adventure that, traveling in by train every day, like a commuter. She had a lot of fun during that year, mixing with boys and girls her own age, having money in her pocket for the first time, and no responsibilities, and all the diversions of Weymouth at her command. She found that she was popular with the boys, and was never short of a companion, and from the same source she discovered that she was pretty, so life was fine by her. She was lucky, too, in spotting the advertisement for the solicitor's job when she did, and in making a good enough impression at her interview to be taken on. For some time after that, she was fully occupied with her job and the necessity of making a good impression. She didn't go out much, spending her evenings repairing and improvising clothes, and going to bed early so as to be sure of getting in on time the next day. And so one by one she lost contact with her old friends. Her mother was ill at that time, too, so there wasn't the impetus to go out. Her mother had often tried to persuade her, and her father had even been worried because she wasn't bringing young men home for him to interview. "If you're not careful, my girl," he had said, "you'll be too late. You'll wake up one morning and find yourself on the shelf." "Don't be silly, Dad," Anne had said. It was too early to worry about that sort of thing. What did happen, however, was that one morning she woke up and found herself bored. And that was the day that fate took a hand. She was opening the second post at around 11 that morning when the street door opened and in came a tall, sun-tanned figure. "Good morning," he said, in such a low voice that it failed altogether, and he had to cough and start again. "Good morning. I wondered if I could see the solicitor." He was evidently a farmer, by his shapeless tweed jacket and his clean white t-shirt, and he was evidently painfully shy. Anne smiled her kindest smile and said, "I should think so. Can you tell me what it's about?" "Well, you see," he began, and at that moment lifted his eyes for the first time and looked at her. Two things happened. Firstly, he became tongue-tied again and stopped in mid-sentence. Secondly, Anne recognized her former hero of the sports field. "Why, you're Joe Halderthay, aren't you?" she cried. He looked surprised and confused. "Well, yes, I am, but I'm afraid—" "Oh, I don't suppose you'd remember me. Anne Simmons. I was a few years younger than you." "Yes, I do. I do remember you, of course," he said, and as Anne raised an eyebrow, thinking he was simply being polite, he went on, "You lived in Winton Harbor, by the railway station." "I still do," Anne said, impressed by his memory. "Fancy you remembering that. I never supposed you even noticed." "Oh, yes," he said eagerly. "I always thought you were—" He broke off, looking confused, and though Anne prompted him gently, he wouldn't go on. "So what are you doing these days?" she asked in the end. "I'm a stockman on Haldane's farm," he said. "Cattle?" Anne asked. "Pigs," he replied, and a gleam of pleasure lit his eyes at the very word. "I'm specializing in them, especially in the breeding. Fascinating animals." "I don't know that I've ever cared for them," Anne said, wrinkling her nose, "though I suppose they're better than sleep. What does your wife think?" "I'm sorry?" "Of the pigs. Does she like pigs?" "My wife? But I'm not married," he said, bewildered. "Oh dear, I'm sorry. I thought you were married to—what's her name?" "The eldest Moore girl. You used to work on their farm, didn't you?" "That was Jenny, yes. I used to go out with her when I worked at Moore's, but we broke it off when I went to Aldane's. We were never serious about each other anyway." "I always assumed you married her. I don't know why," Anne said vaguely. "I think she married a chap from the automatic factory in the end," Joe said. "And what about you? What do you do?" "Well, as you see," Anne said, waving a hand round at the office, "I work here." Joe was abashed again. "Of course, silly of me," he muttered. He was silent, and Anne realized that she still didn't know what he had come for. She waited for him to say something, and since it appeared that he was tongue-tied again, she prompted him gently. "You were going to tell me what you came to see us about when I interrupted you." "Oh, yes. Well, you see, I'm hoping in the end to buy a place of my own and set up in pigs. I'm head stockman now on Haldanes, and I'm studying at night, and I should be able to get a manager's job in a year or two. Then I'll be able to save up to get a deposit on a place." He forgot his shyness when he was talking about his favorite subject, and Anna noticed how handsome he looked, and his eyes shone, and his expression was animated. There are special arrangements for mortgages on farmland, special rates, and so on, and with a couple of years as a manager behind me and a cash deposit, I think I could get a mortgage on a smallish place, enough to set up for a start. "How would you buy the stock?" Anne asked. "That's covered by the mortgage too," Joe said, evidently pleased that she was taking an interest in his plans. "I've even seen a bit of land that I think would be just the thing. It's lying fallow at the moment, and there's a cottage on the land falling down and hardly any roof on it. It looks as though it's been empty for years." "Where is it?" Anne asked. Anything to do with land interested her. "It's out on the Weymouth Road, about 3 or 4 miles out of Springbourne." "I think I know where you mean," Anne said. "There's a little side turning just the other side of that big Dutch barn. Then it all lies uphill." "That's right, you've got it. Well-drained land. And that's why I came here. I thought you might be able to tell me who owns it and why it's not being farmed." "I suppose it's early days yet to be inquiring about land when I haven't even got my manager's job yet, but it's on my mind so much I thought I'd have to find out." "Well, I'm sure we can help you," Anne said. "And then, just out of interest, why did you choose this particular firm rather than any other?" "I don't know. I saw the sign in the window. You see, you can see this window from the market. I'm up here every Thursday for the market. I asked 1 or 2 people, and they said this was an old-fashioned kind of family firm, so I thought you'd be more likely to know about that sort of thing. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason really, just interested," Anne said. "You seem to be interested in a lot of things," Joe said. "For him, greatly daring," Anne smiled. "You hold on there for a minute, Joe, and I'll see if Mr. Cass will see you now, to save you coming back again. I'm sure it must be hard for you to get time off from the farm." She left him there and slipped into Mr. Cass's office. She couldn't let poor Joe be eaten alive by Mr. Wetfloor. And in any case, Mr. Cass knew practically every inch of this part of Dorset, having done the conveyancing on nearly every part that had ever changed hands. Anne explained to her boss what was wanted, and Mr. Cass agreed to see Joe. "If it's a friend of yours, Anne, I think it's the least I can do," he said, unbending for the first time since she had joined the company. She thanked him and went back to the outer office. "If you'd like to come through, Joe, Mr. Cass will see you now." Joe jumped up nervously, and she showed him in. If he had been a cap wearer, he would have been twisting it in his hands. and shut the door after him and went smiling back to her desk. She had expected their interview to last only a few moments, but as the time passed and Joe didn't come out, Anne got on with her work and had quite forgotten he was in there by the time the inner door opened again. "Well, goodbye, and thanks very much," Joe was saying, and he came out and shut the door. "Everything okay?" Anne asked him. "Oh, yes, thanks. He's very nice, isn't he?" "Mr. Cass?" "Yes, I think so. Did he tell you what you wanted to know?" "He thinks the land belongs to a trust set up for a miner, but he's going to find out for sure and let me know. He says if that's the case, the land could be sold when the miner comes of age, which would probably be in a few years' time. That would suit me just fine." "So it would," Anne said. "Well, I'm very pleased for you." She looked up at him patiently. He was standing on the other side of her desk, and she was waiting for him to take his departure before she went on with her work. But he didn't seem in any hurry to go. She wondered suddenly if he thought he had to pay her for the interview, and to help him out, she said, "Mr. Cass will send you his bill when he's finished doing what you asked. I don't expect it will be too much." She would have the handling of the correspondence, of course, so she could keep an eye on that aspect of things. "Yes, I see," Joe said. There was another silence, at the end of which both of them spoke at once. "Do you? I hope—" "Go on," Joe said. "I was just going to say I hope everything goes well and right for you." "What were you going to say?" "Do you like working here?" Joe said, after a measurable pause, and Anne had the feeling that was not what he'd meant to say at all. "Oh, yes, I find it very interesting. It has its dull moments, like any job, of course, but that can't be helped, and it's nice working right in town like this." "I suppose you go out a lot in the evenings, I mean," Joe said next. "Not a lot," Anne said. "My mother's not well, and I tend to stay home to keep her company." "Oh," he said, and seemed disappointed. Anne now had an inkling of what he was aiming at, and she waited, amused, to see how long he took to get there. "But you go out at the weekends. I suppose you have lots of friends?" "I do go out when I have someone to go with. I seem to have lost touch with most of my friends from the old days, so I don't seem to get asked very much." "I wondered," Joe began, looking in any direction but at her. "Yes?" "I wondered if you would think of perhaps if I could take you out somewhere." He got it out at last. His face was red under the tan, but Anne had no inclination to laugh at him. He was not ridiculous, only rather endearing. "Yes, I think I'd like that, Joe." "When had you in mind?" "Well, I don't know if it's possible for you, but I was thinking of maybe Thursday after the market. I'm in town anyway, you see, and I could get a wash and change at the hotel, and then pick you up by about 7. It isn't easy to get away other days, not until quite late." "Well, Thursday would be fine by me." "You'll come and pick me up, you say?" "Yes. You still live in the same place, don't you?" "Yes, by the station." "All right. Thursday at about 7 then?" "I won't be late," he promised. He smiled at her now and seemed about to say something else, but closed his mouth again and simply nodded, smiled, and left. She broke the good news to her father when she got home that night. "Someone's coming to pick me up and take me out on Thursday, Dad," she said, as she sat down to her tea. "A young man?" he asked eagerly. "Is it someone we know, dear?" her mother asked. "I don't know if you know him. He was at the same school as me, but he's older. We weren't in the same class." "Well, what's he called?" Dad asked. "Joe Alderthay. I don't know the name. He was very good at sports, won all the cups on sports day," Anne said. "Oh, that big redhead boy?" her mother said. "I remember him, though I didn't know his name." "And what does he do for a living?" Dad asked sternly, and began to laugh. "Now, Dad, you mustn't put him through the Spanish Inquisition when he comes on Thursday. He's very shy, and in any case, I'm not thinking of marrying him. I'm only going to go out with him for an evening." "You never know what may come out of it," her father warned. "Anyway, I have to know if he's a suitable person for my girl to go out with." "I'm sure he's very suitable, Dad. He's clean and well-mannered, and he's a stockman on Aldane's farm. I'm sure if you rang them up, they'd give him a reference." Her father stared for a moment, and then reached over and pinched her cheek. "None of your sauce, Miss Anne." "All right, so I fuss a bit, but you're my only daughter, and you'll have one day, and then you'll know how I feel." Anne smiled back at him. "I know how you feel, Dad, and Joe Alderthay is respectable enough to suit even you."